I call the honourable member Moana Maki.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I want to go back to a comment that Bill English made, because I think it bears repeating. And it was just one of those off-the-cuff comments that he made when he was doing his little routine there after my colleague Grant Robertson's very good speech. And he said Grant Robertson had spent all his speech talking about issues that, quote, don't matter to New Zealanders. Now, what did Grant Robertson spend most of his speech talking about? Child poverty. Child poverty. What a telling statement from the Minister of Finance, that the national government thinks that child poverty is an issue that doesn't matter to New Zealanders. And then we had the new Minister, Jo Goodhue. Well, she spent a large part of her speech talking about how National spent the last 3 years protecting the vulnerable. Well, I'd like to know what Jo Goodhue's definition of vulnerable is, because I can't think of any vulnerable New Zealanders who were better off at the end of the last National government than when National was elected in 2008. Maybe she was talking about vulnerable National Party donors, because they were certainly looked after in the last 3 years of a National government. Maybe she was talking about all those vulnerable foreign multinational companies, because they certainly were looked after under the last 3 years of a National government. Maybe she's talking about those poor, vulnerable Australian insurance companies who are about to benefit from the privatisation of ACC. National's certainly doing a good job of protecting them over the next 3 years, although they also fall into the category, I suspect, of vulnerable National Party donors. But we'll never know, because the National Party refuses to disclose who donates to their election campaigns. Because when you look at what National did in the last 3 years, unaffordable tax cuts which overwhelmingly went to those who didn't need them, who needed them the least. And how can the Minister, Jo Goodhue, stand up in this House and say National protected the vulnerable when, to pay for those tax cuts, they cut funding for Women's Refuge? Mr Ardern, a very sensible member, how is cutting the funding for Women's Refuge protecting vulnerable New Zealanders? All to pay for tax cuts that went to the least vulnerable New Zealanders. How are cuts to early childhood education protecting vulnerable New Zealanders? How is it good for children in this country that the National Party have now told us they're going to increase class sizes? How is that protecting the most vulnerable New Zealanders? How is rising child poverty in this country, how does that fit with National's claim that they've protected vulnerable New Zealanders? And isn't it interesting that the reaction from the National Party about a TV3 documentary on child poverty wasn't, oh my God, we should do something about child poverty. It was, oh my God, we should stop New Zealand On Air from funding documentaries about child poverty. And we should not let them be played in the week of an election campaign, because God forbid that we talk about an issue like child poverty in an election campaign. Very telling that their reaction to that documentary wasn't let's do something about child poverty, it's let's shut down talking about child poverty because we know it's worse under our watch and we know we have absolutely no plan to deal with it. And I remember John Key's speech from the throne after the 2008 election. This was when he was aspirational for New Zealand. He was going to be turbocharging the New Zealand economy. We were going to be aggressively coming out of recession very, very soon. And of course, failing to mention the fact that in large part they would have been able to do that because Labor left the books in a good state. The International Monetary Fund said that if it hadn't been for Labor paying off our government debt and saving that money for a rainy day, New Zealand would not be in the good situation that it was in to deal with the global recession. The National Party like to say that, well, New Zealand went into recession for the rest of the world. Yes, we did, because we had droughts. That's why we went into recession early. In fact, New Zealand was in a very good position after the 2008 election because of the resilience that Labor had built into the economy. And unfortunately, that was squandered by a government that had no plan to deal with the major issues facing our country over their 3 years in government. But that was the idea. John Key, he was going to deal to unemployment, he was going to close the gap with Australia, bring New Zealand aggressively out of recession and back into surplus. He was going to be straight up with voters, he wasn't going to mince his words. And so what happened? Well, in fact, he failed on every single count. Every single count. He's almost like a child waiting for Santa Claus at Christmas. I suspect he woke up every morning just hoping that the free market will have fixed the problems overnight and he wouldn't have to do anything because the free market fixes everything. Well, it hasn't, and we've gone backwards comparatively in the world because we've had a do-nothing government for 3 years. The only thing they have done is protect those people who support them, protect those their mates, their cronies. They're the only people that were protected under the National Government over the last 3 years. So instead of being straight up with voters, John Key now says that we have to accept that we live in a dynamic environment. We live in a dynamic environment, so he's not straight up with voters anymore. In terms of Australia, last year saw the highest ever net migration to Australia. Unemployment up by 50%, 157,000 New Zealanders now out of work, and for the first time in 13 years, not only did we get a credit downgrade, we got a double downgrade. A double downgrade. So much for turbocharging the economy, so much for being aspirational, so much for aggressively coming out of recession. So in last year's speech from the throne, after the recent election, what I could see is that the Prime Minister had learnt the lesson of making these commitments and then actually being held to account for them. And so what he did in this one was he didn't make any commitments. Didn't make any kind of promises that he could actually be held to account against. Because there is still no plan for the economy, and that was evident in the speech from the throne. And I think if you consider, today we had the very first question time since the election. Very first question time. So the government has the opportunity to ask themselves lots of questions which highlight all the great policies and plans and exciting new ideas that they have, because they're recharged, ready for the next 3 years. And what did we have? Another question from Maurice Williamson on SmartGate. Now, that's normally a question that we get in the third week of a sitting session when the government is struggling to come up with questions. The first question time of this new parliament, and already they're having to bring out the Maurice Williamson SmartGate question. That tells you something. Well, he did have a new angle on it this time, which was adolescent facial features. It was a new angle. I'm not saying it wasn't interesting. But the reality is, with all due respect to the wonderful people at Customs, there are slightly more pressing issues facing this country than whether or not 16-year-olds' faces are still developing and whether or not we can let them use SmartGate at our international airports. This was an opportunity for the government to tell us what they are going to do over the course of this year to highlight their plans, but of course they don't have a plan. And the reality is the opportunities are there. The opportunities are there for the government to do what they said they were going to do 3 years ago but have failed to do, aggressively bring our economy out of recession, to get people back into work, to improve our education system, not destroy it, which is quite frankly where these government's policies are going. But again, in the speech from the throne, nothing. No plan, and this time he's learnt no commitments that he could actually be held accountable for at the time of the next election, because he failed to meet any of the commitments he made in his last 3 years of government. So this time we had absolutely no commitments. And I invite members to look at the plan that Labor put forward at the last election, because our tax package got New Zealand back to surplus at the same time as the National Party was promising, without selling our assets. Without selling our assets. But it requires tough choices to be made. And the government says it has a mandate on asset sales. It actually doesn't. When you add up the percentage of the vote that was gained by all those parties that opposed asset sales, including those that didn't make it into this parliament because they failed to reach the 5% threshold, actually more than 50% of New Zealanders voted for parties that had policies opposing asset sales. So there is no mandate for it. And the government talks about their future investment fund. And I had a school principal in Gisborne say to me that 21st century education isn't a one-off cost. So saying that we're going to sell off our assets to put a bit of money into schools on a one-off basis just shows how little they understand about education. Because 21st century education is an ongoing cost, and you can only sell those assets once. Once they're gone, they're gone. Assets built up by generations of New Zealanders that this government has no mandate to sell. Once they're gone, they're gone. And particularly in the case of the power companies, we will see power prices going up. People are already struggling to pay the power bill, and we will see power prices going up when those assets are privatised. And it's shortchanging future generations, Mr. Speaker, because future generations are asking, where is the National Government's plan to deal with the cost of an ageing population? Where was that plan in the speech from the throne? The fact is, we can't keep putting it off, because it's all right for John Key, he'll get his super, but what about younger New Zealanders now who are looking and thinking there is no way, given the ageing population, that New Zealand super at its current level is sustainable if we don't make those tough choices. Well, there were no tough choices made about that, about child poverty, about any of the other issues facing New Zealand. And it's about time the National Party members, when they get up, actually started outlining what their plan is for New Zealand.
I call the honourable member